Okay, so today we're going to break into the endocrine system. Okay, so before we do that, just a quick reminder of what endocrine means, right? When we're talking about the endocrine system, what we're going to be talking about, right, is cell signaling between different parts of the body. So when we have endocrine signaling, that's something that gets into your bloodstream, travels to some other cell somewhere else, and then creates a response in that cell. So we're going to be talking about hormones, but like this is cell signaling. Okay, so we're first going to go through a couple of different glands that produce hormones, and then we're going to start talking about some specific functions. Okay, so endocrine glands come from epithelial tissue originally. Don't worry about that, but like embryologically, epithelial tissue is like linings of stuff. Some of that eventually develops into glands. Okay. When we talk about endocrine organs, we're going to have some things that we refer to as primary endocrine organs, which is something where, like, if you looked at it, it would look like a gland. Its main role is to produce these hormones. A secondary endocrine organ is going to be something where its main role is something else. It's not going to be the first function you think about when you think about that organ, but it does happen to also produce endocrine organs, or does happen to also produce hormones. So we're going to take a look at examples. So this first set are primary endocrine organs. So they're not doing much other than producing these hormones that we're going to talk about. So we're going to focus in extensively on the first one, the hypothalamus in the brain and the pituitary gland. This is going to be controlling a lot of our hormone production throughout the rest of the body, in addition to producing hormones that affect specific cells. Okay. We'll also have the pineal gland in the brain. Your thyroid gland and your parathyroid glands are located in your neck. The thymus, usually much larger in children than in adults, but it's also in your neck approximately. Your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys. That's actually where their name comes, ad, and then renal. Renal means kidney. Okay. Your pancreas is an organ that sits kind of behind your stomach. It's going to produce hormones related to sort of to digestion, but regulating metabolism as you eat as well. And then the gonads, so like genitals, also produce hormones. But we also have secondary endocrine organs. So this is what I mean when I say that there are things that produce hormones, but you don't think of them primarily as an endocrine organ. So like the heart is a secondary endocrine organ. The heart actually does produce hormones. Specifically, it produces one called atrial natriuretic peptide. So we may talk about that when we get to the heart. We definitely will talk about the hormone coming from the kidneys as we move forward. So your kidneys produce something called erythropoietin. This helps the development of red blood cells, basically. It tells your body when to make blood. There are lots of hormones in the GI tract, the liver, the skin, and the kidneys, and the fat. So don't worry about memorizing all of those, but know that we have secondary endocrine organs. They have important other functions, but they do also signal to cells throughout your body and have roles in this kind of big network kind of process. Okay. So we are going to focus in on the hypothalamus and its interaction with the pituitary gland first. Okay. So the hypothalamus, this region right here, right? So here's, let's find a better color. Okay. So your hypothalamus is here. All right, so we're looking at a mid-sagittal section of the brain. Here's our hypothalamus, okay? And it has a little stalk called the infundibulum that attaches it to the pituitary gland. Hopefully so far so good, because we've been looking at this in lab, sort of, right? So hypothalamus connected to the pituitary gland by the infundibulum. When we zoom in on the pituitary gland, we're going to see that it is also divided in half. So we're going to be talking about the anterior pituitary gland separately from the posterior pituitary gland. So these two parts of the pituitary gland are going to function different physiologically, and they are going to produce different hormones. So we're going to start with the posterior pituitary, so the back half. Okay, so the way the posterior pituitary is going to work, we are going to have cells starting in our hypothalamus. Right, so up here, we're looking at the hypothalamus, and we can see the beginning of a neuron. But we're starting in the hypothalamus with a neuron that extends through the infundibulum and into the posterior pituitary. So the body of our neuron, the soma, is up here in the hypothalamus. Here we see the axon running through the infundibulum. And here we see those axon terminals releasing their neurotransmitters here in the posterior pituitary. So this means that our posterior pituitary hormones, those ones being released by those axon terminals, we can think of them as neurotransmitters, or we can think of them as hormones, right? They're both. They're being released by a neuron, but they are going to go into the bloodstream, right? So what we've drawn on here is blood. So they're going into the bloodstream, and then they're going to go out to the body somewhere, right? So they're going to go do that. They're going to go back to the heart, then they're going to circulate throughout the body. So that's their hormone function, signaling to somewhere else in the body. And their neurotransmitter bit is because they've been secreted from a neuron. Okay, so that's where this term neurohormone comes from. So we haven't been secreted by a glandular type of tissue per se. We've had this secreted by a neuron. Okay. So there are two peptide hormones being released by the posterior pituitary. So a peptide refers to like a protein, right? So some of our hormones are based on protein, and some of our hormones are going to be lipids. So these two peptide hormones from the posterior pituitary are antidiuretic hormone, which we'll usually call ADH. It is also called vasopressin. Okay. So antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, is going to go to the kidney primarily. And in the kidney, it's going to help you regulate the amount of water that your kidneys pull out of your blood and back into the body. And so ADH in that way is going to partially regulate your blood pressure and your blood volume. So we'll talk extensively about this hormone when we get to our renal unit in A&P 2. Okay. So that's ADH, coming from the posterior pituitary, the neurohormone, peptide hormone secreted from those neurons. Okay. Oxytocin is also a neurohormone of the posterior pituitary. Okay. So sometimes I refer to oxytocin as being in charge of love, lust, and labor, or at least I saw that as a title on a scientific article, which was, I don't know, maybe kind of cringy, maybe not, but memorable regardless, right? So oxytocin is going to, again, get released from these neurons that are extending from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary. And it has a pretty complex role in the brain and then throughout the body. So some of the effects that we see in the body are like milk ejection during breastfeeding. So it helps with lactation. It also has a role in uterine contractions during labor. So giving birth, oxytocin is involved here. It also has a pretty complex role in sexual responses in all genders, actually. So that's oxytocin. That's our second posterior pituitary hormone. So questions about this neurohormone idea, because when we talk about the anterior pituitary, we're going to be contrasting. We're going to see a different system of releasing hormones. Okay. Unfortunately, the reason I'm asking that question is because the anterior pituitary is a little more complicated, right? So posterior pituitary, just a neuron sticking down into the posterior pituitary from the hypothalamus. But when we think about the anterior pituitary, we're going to have to think about something called a tropic hormone. Okay. So a tropic hormone, it's going to be a hormone that like runs in a cascade. It's like a domino effect, right? So a tropic hormone is going to set off a domino effect in your body where other hormones get released in response. Okay. So I said get released in response. So I was emphasizing the stimulating part. That usually is the case. Most of our tropic hormones increase response, the production of other hormones, but we do have a couple that also inhibit, but they're affecting the release of other hormones. Okay. So the way we are going to have these tropic hormones operating a little different. Okay, so we still have a neuron in the hypothalamus, but this time we see that the whole soma is in the hypothalamus, so that whole cell body, the whole axon, and the axon terminal. That whole structure is located in the hypothalamus. Okay. So we're going to have to get those neurotransmitters. Now we're referring to them as tropic hormones. We'll see why in a second. We're going to have to get them to the anterior pituitary, and we're going to have to get hormones out to the rest of the body some other way than we did in the posterior pituitary. Okay. So what we're going to see is these tropic hormones. Right? We see them here in our axon terminal being stored in the neuron that's in the hypothalamus. Okay. So when we release these tropic hormones, they're going to get into the bloodstream here, into a capillary bed. So a capillary bed is just a fine network of blood vessels that is basically designed for exchange with tissue. And we'll talk a lot about capillaries in the future and how exactly that works. But we have these hormones, these tropic hormones, going into this capillary bed. So now they're in your blood. However, now they have to get to some other cells in order to affect the release of another hormone, because that's what a tropic hormone does. All right, so they're going to move from this capillary bed into a vein that runs through the infundibulum. All right, so they're traveling here, and then they're going to enter another capillary bed. So we have two capillary beds linked together by this vein running through the infundibulum. Okay, so we still see these tropic hormones here. And this is the point at which they are going to come into contact with an endocrine cell in the anterior pituitary. Okay, so they've come into the cell, into this endocrine cell. And this is how they affect our next hormone in this sort of chain, in this set of dominoes, right? So they're going to affect the release of this second hormone, which then also goes into the capillary bed. But now it's that second hormone that goes out to the rest of the body. Okay. So we have this sort of domino effect where we have the release of a tropic hormone from these neurons in the hypothalamus. They go into a capillary bed in the hypothalamus and travel through a vein in the infundibulum, enter a second capillary bed, then enter the endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary and affect the release of new hormones from the anterior pituitary. So this system that we've just described is a portal system. So a portal system is this part here, right? So the fact that we have two capillary beds linked together, and we have exchange happening in both, and we have communication between them, that's a portal system. So this is a general term. This is one of the most important portal systems for our purposes. But if you look at organs in the abdomen, there's a very important portal system that runs through the liver as well. So that concept may come back again in the future. So portal system is linking together two capillary beds, and a capillary bed is where we have exchange between the blood and the tissue. So we're going to be thinking about the specific hormones that we release from this hypothalamic-pituitary portal system. And when we talk about these hypothalamic and pituitary hormones, we will also refer to something called the hypothalamic-pituitary axis. Pituitary axis. Okay, so when we refer to that, we're referring to the fact that we have hormones coming from those neurosecretory cells. They go through this portal system, right, to the anterior pituitary, and then those anterior pituitary hormones enter this capillary system and then out to the rest of the body through the blood. Now, I've been referring to the hypothalamic hormones as tropic hormones, which they are. Is the case that a lot of our anterior pituitary hormones are also tropic hormones. So our anterior pituitary hormones that are going out into the body here, right, at the end of this portal system, they're going to go out to a bunch of your other endocrine glands. Right? So like, we'll talk about the thyroid, right, for example, in the neck. Right, so you're going to have anterior pituitary tropic hormones going there and then affecting the release of a third hormone from that next endocrine gland. Okay. So a whole big domino effect is what we're talking about when we talk about tropic hormones, and it's keyed in on this portal system between the hypothalamus and the pituitary.
Is the endocrine cell also release tropic hormones?
Depends on which endocrine cell you're talking about. So these ones in the anterior pituitary, yes.
Okay.
And we'll see which ones specifically come as tropic hormone. So a tropic hormone is just anything that affects the release of another hormone. Yeah. So before we get into the specific hormones, there is control on this process, right? There is neural input, so there are other neurons connecting into the hypothalamus, controlling how it releases those initial tropic hormones. There are some hormonal effects. We know that negative feedback plays a big role in the body, and this is going to be true for a bunch of our anterior pituitary hormones, especially. So at the end of A&P2, we'll talk about like the menstrual cycle and the ovarian cycle. That's a big place where we see hormonal regulation of some of these pituitary hormones. Your circadian rhythm also affects the release of the anterior pituitary hormones. So your circadian rhythm comes from a very specific place in the hypothalamus, something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And basically all this is saying, the circadian rhythm is on this side. What we're saying is that you release different hormones when you're awake versus when you're asleep, right? There is kind of a rhythm to your day. So that kind of plays a role into when you're releasing these hormones. So really to hammer home, right? So we have a flow chart version of this process, right? So our first tropic hormone gets released from the hypothalamus. Then our next tropic hormone gets released from the anterior pituitary. And then that hormone goes out to another endocrine gland somewhere in the body. We see a third hormone. And then that hormone goes to some target cell where we have a response. Okay, so that's our whole domino effect. But we do have regulation here. So what we have listed here as well are our negative feedback loops. So our negative feedback loops are going to be going back mostly to this first part, to the hypothalamus. Right, so here we see a long loop for our negative feedback. So we're going towards the end of our domino chain, right, to that hormone 3. And it's going all the way back up and affecting the hypothalamus. So that's our long loop negative feedback. Our short loop negative feedback is where we have our anterior pituitary, right, which is our second hormone, just directly going back and affecting the hypothalamus. So this has to do with like kind of the distance they're traveling approximately, right? So by affecting this first step, the release of these hormones from the hypothalamus, we then regulate the whole pathway. We're thinking negative feedback. We're thinking about basically turning this pathway off. All right. So that is the whole process for all of these hormones. So these are all our specific examples of our hypothalamic tropic hormones affecting our anterior pituitary, usually tropic hormones. Okay, so what we're charting here, right? Here are our neurons in the hypothalamus, right? So we'll just do this first example. So from our hypothalamus, we would be releasing PRH in this case, which is prolactin releasing hormone. Okay. So prolactin releasing hormone would then travel through our portal system, would get into the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary. That's what these green ones are. Okay. And then these endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary would release prolactin, which has an effect on breasts. Okay. So that is a relatively sort of short pathway. You'll see that some of these other pathways, we then have a third hormone, right? So when we get to the thyroid gland, right, we'll have our thyroid releasing hormone going through the portal system. And we have our TSH, our thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary going to the thyroid gland. And then the thyroid gland itself releases thyroid hormones, which would then go out and affect other cells in your body. So when you are studying, you should spend some time practicing going through these examples and explaining them to yourself and your friends. We will focus in on some of them as more important, at least for our purposes for this course, for this unit. So we are going to focus in on thyroid hormones a fair bit. We'll be talking about, let's see, the cortisol response we'll talk about a lot, right? Because this is basically your stress response. Skimming through. And then in A&P2, we'll be coming back to this last one a lot. So going to the gonads and then regulation of basically sexual reproduction and hormonal cycles. So if you want to target in, I would start with these three, probably start with these two, and then add on that third. Okay. Trick for remembering these things though, if you're stuck trying to figure out whether you're looking in a long list at a hypothalamic tropic hormone or an anterior pituitary hormone, notice how many of these end in RH, right? Almost all of them, right? So RH, right? The RH stands for the releasing hormone, right? So they all end in RH because these are hypothalamic tropic hormones, and they are going to go tell the anterior pituitary to release something else, right? And you'll notice that none of our anterior pituitary hormones end in RH, right? So RH is a giveaway that we're thinking about a hypothalamic tropic hormone. The only exceptions here where we see IH, right, is that we have an inhibiting hormone, right? So it's still telling you that we are a tropic hormone affecting how another hormone is functioning. Now, adding on to that, right, when we're looking at these acronyms, let's look at thyroid, right? So we have our thyroid releasing hormone. So that is also telling us the end of the pathway, right? It's telling us the thyroid part, so we know where we're going. And then our anterior pituitary hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, is also telling us like what pathway we're on. So the names are all going to be kind of linked together, kind of telling you, or at least attempting to tell you their function. So we're going to go ahead and look at that chart and we'll run through an example. So I want you to start with CRH and write out either arrows, draw it, describe it in words. I don't care how you do it. But write down for yourself what happens when CRH gets released from the hypothalamus. So we're focusing in here on this hypothalamic-pituitary axis. All right, so we're looking at this whole flow here. Okay. So CRH is our corticotropin releasing hormone. All right, corticotropin releasing hormone. ACTH is another hormone we're going to look at in our pathway. So ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone. So telling us it's another tropic hormone. It's going to go to the adrenal glands. And then from the adrenal glands, we're going to see cortisol. Okay, so we might have written out something like, right? So we have our CRH from the hypothalamus. Okay, we're going to go into capillary bed 1. What I'm going to do here is describe the portal system, right? So capillary bed 1 to a vein, our portal vein, to capillary bed 2. Okay, so that's our portal system that I just described here. Okay. So now we're going to go into the anterior pituitary endocrine cells. Which are going to release our adrenocorticotropic hormone, our ACTH. Okay. Which then goes into our capillary bed, number 2, and out to systemic circulation, which is going to be our more important part here. Now they're traveling through our system. So that vein would go back to the heart. Your heart would pump out blood. Then that blood would get to your adrenal gland. Which is then going to release cortisol. So questions about this process now that you've tried it a little bit yourself. Okay. Cool. That is what we are doing when we are talking about the anterior pituitary specifically. So this is not going on with our posterior pituitary. This is just an anterior pituitary kind of system. Okay. So now we're going to move on and talk about some of our primary endocrine organs. Okay. So our pineal gland is one of our other locations for glandular tissue. Okay, so your pineal gland, fun fact, Descartes called it like the seat of the soul. There's some mysticism around the pineal gland. But what your pineal gland does is secrete melatonin. So if you take melatonin before bedtime, you try to relax, go to sleep, what you're doing is trying to basically simulate what your pineal gland does as daylight darkens at the end of the day. So the theory here is that melatonin is somehow involved in circadian rhythms. We do know that in seasonal mammals, like things that hibernate, right? Melatonin plays a big role there, and the pineal gland plays a big role there. So we think that maybe melatonin and the pineal gland are doing something similar in human sleep-wake cycles. All right. Our next gland we're thinking about, now we're moving out of our brain case and we're moving out into the body. So we're going to think first about our thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is in your neck. So what we're looking at here, all right, so we see the head, neck, shoulders. Here's your hyoid bone, that floating bone in the neck. And when we talk about the neck eventually, this is your larynx. So that's your like voice box, or if you feel kind of like your Adam's apple, that's approximately where we are. So just below it, just inferior to it, we have our thyroid gland. We'll see that our parathyroid glands are actually sitting on the tissue of the thyroid gland as well. So we'll talk about them after we talk about thyroid. Okay. So there are 2 thyroid hormones, tetraiodothyronine and triiodothyronine, but we really mainly refer to them as T4 and T3. Okay. But that does tell you the name, right? If you're staring at it. So tetra is 4. Iodo is going to tell you that iodine is going to play a big role in thyroid function. And then the thyrine because it's from the thyroid. Same thing for T3. So we just have tri, 3, iodo because of the iodine, and then thyrine because we're coming from the thyroid. So usually when we think about thyroid function, we're thinking about T4, this first one, also sometimes called thyroxine. It's more abundant in your body. And we're actually going to see that we have some conversion between T3 and T4 happening as well as we produce and use our thyroid hormones. Okay. We will, at some point, just want to remember that calcitonin also exists, regulates calcium levels in the blood, but we're really focusing in on thyroid hormones right now here. Okay. Okay. Before we get into the next slide about like the process of thyroid hormones, it's something somewhat topical, right? There's war in Ukraine, right? The Russians in the spring captured Chernobyl, a big nuclear power plant. Back in Ukrainian hands now, but there is also a rush on iodine pills in Central and Eastern Europe. So as we think about our thyroid hormones, we want to kind of think about why, right? So iodine pills are something that is sometimes recommended when there's nuclear fallout. So like directly before or right after a nuclear explosion, certain people, basically people under 40 and people who are breastfeeding, are recommended to take pills replacing the iodine that you're getting from your environment with potassium iodide. These pills that are given out by pharmacies by the government. The reason for that is that after a nuclear explosion, there's a bunch of radioactive iodine in your environment, and your body can't tell it's radioactive, right? It's going to use it just like normal iodine, which means that you're going to infect your thyroid gland with a bunch of radioactive iodine and potentially cause thyroid cancer. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the flow of the production of thyroid hormones, and we're going to just sort of pay attention a little bit as we're looking at that role of iodine so that we can kind of understand why this process can be important. Okay. So try to collapse a bunch of stuff into one piece here. What we're looking at on the top is we have an image of our cells, right? So if you like looking at images of steps, you can focus in on this image. Or if you prefer our flow charts, all that's over here, but they're talking about the same thing, right? Or you can focus on the words on the slide. Okay. So when we're thinking about our thyroid hormones, right, we're thinking about the release of thyroid hormones. We're going to start out with our hypothalamic-pituitary axis. We're going to start with thyroid releasing hormone in the hypothalamus. And then that's going through our portal system. It's going to go tell the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay. And then that is going to go down to the thyroid gland. Okay. So what's happening in the thyroid gland is the cells around the edges of the thyroid gland, called follicular cells, just like kind of all the time produce something called thyroid globulin. So it's just going to be hanging out in basically this reservoir in the thyroid called the colloid. Okay. So thyroid globulin is hanging out in this colloid in the thyroid. Okay. So what happens next is that we're going to have iodine moving into the thyroid. So iodine moves into the thyroid, gets in there into the colloid, and it reacts with our thyroid globulin. Okay. So you can see it reacting with the thyroid globulin here. And what it's doing is it's forming those T3 and T4 hormones. They're still all bound together, the T3, the T4, and the thyroid globulin, but we've basically made their precursors. All we have to do is break them apart now, right? So we used iodine to create that T3 and T4 from the thyroid globulin, okay? And then that signal from the anterior pituitary, that TSH that we've been secreting, this is now coming in to our cell, and it's telling us to release that T3 and T4. Okay, so here we see that we had thyroid stimulating hormone in the blood, goes into a receptor, or binds onto a receptor, I should say. Okay, and the G protein coupled receptor, we can see it's producing cyclic A&P. All right, so this is a whole process. Its fundamental goal is to get us to grab that T3 and T4 that we've made in the colloid, break it all apart, and secrete it out into the bloodstream. Okay. So that's what's happening here, right? So we're secreting that T3 and T4 when your thyroid set sees, oh, we have this thyroid stimulating hormone coming to us through the bloodstream. Now, to turn off this process, because we don't always want tons and tons of thyroid hormone in your body, we're going to see that thyroid hormones have a big effect on metabolism. Okay? We want to regulate that. So T4 is going to turn off this whole signal. So this is going to go back, that T4 that we put in the blood. It does go out to target cells, but it also loops back and creates negative feedback, turning off that TRH secretion from the hypothalamus. Now, when we're actually looking at tissue, so the target cells for these hormones, right? So the thyroid is not the final step in this process. The target cells are actually things like liver, kidney, muscle, right? At the target tissue, the T4 that we've been making does also get converted to T3. So ultimately, T3 plays more of a role here. But this is our whole kind of process, right? Okay. So now we're going to think about what those thyroid hormones are doing. Okay. So the thyroid hormones are not peptide hormones. They're lipophilic hormones. So they're basically lipids, right? Steroids, we saw were the basis for, or when we talked about steroids briefly, I said that they're the basis for some of our hormones, right? So we thought about like cholesterol. So if you are into chemistry and into thinking about those shapes, that's the kind of thing you're looking at, okay? But for our purposes, those thyroid hormones, they're going to interact nicely with fat tissue. Their role in the body is usually that they're going to alter rates of transcription of mRNA, right? So they're going to affect sort of genetic processes, right? So we know that the way we make proteins that go out and do stuff in the body, right? If we have DNA in the nucleus of our cell, then we have our messenger RNA, takes that message from our genetic code out into the cell. Our ribosomes help us produce a protein. Protein actually does something, right? So our protein might be a receptor, our protein might be a structural protein, our protein might be an enzyme. Okay. So by changing that transcription of mRNA, we're going to be changing the rate at which we produce these proteins. We're going to be changing, basically what we make that's going to go out and have an effect in the body. Okay. So there are conditions related to thyroid hormones. So your book calls one of them cretinism, which is an obsolete term, right? We don't call it that anymore. But something called congenital hypothyroidism is like a really extreme version of not having enough thyroid hormone, especially during development, basically. So this is usually caused by the mother pregnant, not having enough like iodine. That can be one of the causes. Not having that thyroid develop normally, and therefore not having enough thyroid hormone available as a child is developing. So this can cause physical abnormalities. This can cause mental effects. Fortunately, these days they test babies, like when they're born, they test newborns, check their thyroid levels, and you can administer thyroid hormones to kind of fix this. So this isn't, as far as I know, a big problem in the world anymore, at least not here. But we do have other issues related to thyroid hormones. Neither too much nor too little thyroid hormone is good for you, basically. If you have too little thyroid hormone, you're gonna have like a really low metabolism, which will make you lethargic, kind of produce brain fog, gain weight. If you have too much thyroid hormone, you're gonna drop a ton of weight, your hair is gonna fall out, you're gonna get super cranky. Neither of those are great, right? Both of them are issues. Okay. So these thyroid hormones that are affecting the rate of transcription of the mRNA are going to be affecting basically a lot of different things, but primarily what we're interested in for now is our metabolism. So they're going to be increasing the rate of our sodium potassium pumps. So we're going to have a lot more sodium potassium pumps using ATP. We are going to have a lot more mitochondria, and our mitochondria are bigger. So we know mitochondria are how we produce ATP, right? So we're going to be able to break down more glucose faster as we have more mitochondria. They're going to increase those nice enzymes in the electron transport chain. So enzymes related to oxidative phosphorylation. The thyroid hormones are also going to affect some complicatedly named processes that we think we went over pretty quickly. So glycogenolysis, that breaking down glycogen, right? So it's going to enhance how you break down glycogen, which was our storage molecule for glucose. Right, so we're going to break down that glycogen. Also going to increase our proteolysis, so breaking down protein, proteo for protein, lysis again for breaking down. Same thing for lipids, right? So we're going to break more lipids down for energy as well, right? At the same time, We're going to be making a bunch more glucose. So gluconeogenesis, making new glucose. We're also going to make some ketones. And we're going to make a bunch of beta adrenergic receptors, right? So our beta adrenergic receptors were those ones that involve cyclic A&P. They're those G protein coupled receptors. They react with norepinephrine and epinephrine. So we're going to be changing our response to those hormones from the sympathetic nervous system. I'm going to mention parathyroid hormone because this is the only thing we are saying about parathyroid hormone, and then we'll stop for the day. So your parathyroid glands are located here on the posterior part of your thyroid gland. They are super important. They are super small. If you have thyroid cancer and they have to like remove the parts of your thyroid gland that they sit on, they actually have to take those little parathyroid glands and just like stick them somewhere else in your body, right? So calcium regulation is really important, right? We've seen that calcium and its gradients are how we release neurotransmitters from our axon terminal. Calcium is also going to be really important in muscle function. They're important, they're small. We don't need to know much about that process, but their role in the body is important. Okay, so we'll stop here for today.